Good morning and welcome to the continuation of Track 2, Patient's Role in Drug Discovery. The next session here is going to be focused on clinical trials and how to better understand and participate in clinical trials. My name is Scott Schliebner. I'm Vice President of Scientific Affairs at PRA Health Sciences. I created and lead our Rare Disease Center of Excellence. Happy to be here, thrilled that we can partner with Global Genes on this incredible event and help sponsor. I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker, Kent Thoelke. Kent is a colleague and a friend and an inspiration, and he is he's going to speak with us about how to, understanding clinical trials and how to participate in them better. Kent's title is Executive Vice President of Scientific and Medical Affairs, Safety and Commercialization, ... among the many responsibilities that he has. I understand today's talk might be a little bit interactive, so feel free again to sort of move into the middle if you can. And I will turn it over to Kent, and thanks for being here this morning.
Thanks, Scott. So they asked me to talk today about clinical trials, and as I have met and talked to lots and lots of patients and parents and advocates this last couple of days so far, it is apparent to me there is a broad spectrum of understanding of kind of clinical trials and how it relates to each individual and or the child or patient involved. And so I wanted to give just a little bit of a brief background. I have a few slides, and then really try to make it as interactive as possible. I have been doing clinical drug development for about 25 years. For those of you who are in the audience, does anybody actually know what a CRO is? Handful of people. PRA is a contract research organization. Basically, pharmaceutical and biotech companies, the federal government, most of those organizations don't have the bandwidth to really run global clinical trials. And so they hire companies like ours to actually help them with the drug development. And that is everything from creating protocols and designs, how to answer questions, through running the clinical trials, through working with the federal agencies like the FDA to get new drugs approved. So we kind of are the machine that gets all of that work done. We find clinical trial sites and physicians that have the patients that are running these trials. So likely if there is a drug company trying to do a trial in a rare disease, it is folks like Scott and his team that are reaching out around the world to find those physicians that have your patient, your son, your daughter, your brother, sibling, whatever, to get them into a trial. And so that's what we do. But I wanted to give kind of the 30,000-foot level of what a clinical trial is, kind of dispel some of the myths around clinical trials, give you a little bit of an idea of what actually happens in clinical trials, and then talk a little bit about kind of the uneasiness with working with physicians and researchers when you participate in a trial, some of the disconnect between physicians and patients. The reality is, and you've heard this a lot through Dr. Ring and several of the conversations today, it is a very complex system to get a drug to market. Clinical trials are probably the longest and most complex part of that. And it is a system that was built a long time ago and is probably the worst design system we could have come up with. It is the least patient-friendly. It is the least efficient process. And so as you hear lots of people talk today about how do we make that better, not only are we part of that process to push the system to think about how they can do this better, how we can get drugs to market faster, how we can compress the timelines, but the critical component of that is actually the folks that are in the audience and they're here at Global Genes. It is the patient advocates. It is the patients themselves that have to push that system, that have to raise their voices when they talk to their researchers and their physicians and to their advocates that are out there and the NIH and the federal government. We have to continue to push and say that the status quo just isn't good enough anymore. And that for most of you in the audience, waiting 8, 10, 12 years to get a treatment for your patient, your children, whatever, is simply unacceptable. Most of these folks won't be alive in 10 or 12 years. And so that timeline has to get down to 2 or 3. And there are lots of ways we can do that, and clinical trials are one of them. So for the misperception, I think that most people think of clinical trials as being a guinea pig, right? And that's just not true. there is a tremendous amount of research that goes into medications before they ever get to a patient for the first time. There are years and years of toxicology studies and animal studies in ways to make sure that we know that drug is as safe as possible before we put it into a patient. And so there's lots of fears about, do I really want my child, or do I want to participate in a clinical trial when there's so many unknowns? There are a lot of unknowns, that's true, but there's a tremendous amount of information that's known before we ever put a drug into a patient for the first time. We may not know if it's going to work or be efficacious, but we generally know that it is tremendously safe. So we try to dispel the myth that people are guinea pigs. You are actually part of the solution. We can't bring new drugs to market if patients don't participate in the research process. And so we see it a lot across all indications, not just rare diseases. In the US today, less than 5% of the patient population participates in clinical trials. That's part of the reason as well that drugs take so long to get to market. We don't have enough patients in the clinical trial process on a regular basis to compress the timelines to get drugs to market quicker. The other myth that we see a lot is that this is a last resort. The clinical trials are the last resort. It's really the end of the road. That used to be true 20 years ago when we were trying to run clinical trials. It was like you had run out of everything possible, so you went to your last option, which was a clinical trial. Today, for most patients, clinical trials are a first option. We may employ the standard therapies and just add on new research therapies. There may be no therapies for you, so it really is your only choice. But you shouldn't think of clinical trials as, I'll try that later when I've run out of all my other options. Your first question should be, am I eligible to participate in a clinical trial of some sort? Clinical trials are where the cutting edge research is happening. And so when you're out there searching Google, or you're talking to your physicians, or you're talking to your researchers, or your advocacy groups, it should be one of your first questions. Is there a trial available? And maybe it's not a trial that absolutely fits your genetic mutation. Maybe it's not the absolute fit for your treatment population. But the people working on that trial may know of other trials that are available for you. So just ask the question, ask the question, ask the question. One of the other misperceptions is that clinical trials offer a cure. So the very nature of a clinical trial is that we're trying to answer a question, right? Does the drug or the treatment that we're studying work? And so, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. That's part of research. But we learn just as much from the trials that don't work as we do from the trials that do. The faster we can determine that a trial or a therapy or a strategy isn't working in a patient population, the quicker we can stop that line of research and save additional patients from going on to clinical trials that may not help them at all. What we don't ever want to do is waste a single patient's participation in a trial on a drug that has no chance of being efficacious. The patients in this room, the patients that participate in clinical trials, that is a precious gift that's given to the research community. We have to have a tremendous amount of respect and responsibility for how we treat those patients. And so that means we try to get those trials that don't work out of the system and get those patients into trials that could work quicker. So the idea is that we want to give you the best chance possible, or the patient the best chance possible, by participating in research. But it's not the cure. Not right away. It may get us to a cure. You may benefit from being on that trial. That's the hope if the drug works. But there's always a risk involved in clinical trials that they may not work for you. And given the tremendous heterogeneity we've talked around, the different mutations that happen in a lot of these populations, and how specific some of these drug targets are, it may be very challenging for the clinical trial or the drug you're testing to give you the tremendous benefit you're hoping for, or a cure. What we do see is like what we saw with the Duchenne's approval this last week. There are drugs out there that we get approved, but they only work in a small percentage of the patients. So 10 or 20% of the patients with Duchenne's may benefit from that drug. And even then, the benefit that they're getting may not be a cure, right? It may just help them and their quality of life a little bit better. So there is these thresholds. Some drugs, in some diseases, we absolutely can cure. We've done it with hepatitis these last couple of years. We've had tremendous strides in a number of the childhood leukemias, where we cure 95% of leukemias in children, where before it was only 5%. Everything we have learned from those clinical trials, we are now applying to the rare disease community as well. I did want to talk a little bit about the disconnect between physicians and patients and researchers. Sometimes when you sit down with a physician to talk about a clinical trial, they forget that your knowledge about a clinical trial is far different than what they do every day. They do this every day. So sometimes they're not very good at communicating, and sometimes you really have to step up, and if you don't understand something, you just have to ask questions. There are no dumb questions. I don't care if they're running out of time or if they've got lots of things to do that day. You just keep asking the questions until you get the answers you want. This video clip I thought was really interesting. We hear it a lot on the clinical trial side when patients interact with their physicians for the first time, and it goes something like this. Oh, not like that. How does that play? Can somebody play that for me? Use the magic of technology? Or not? Well, they figure that out. I'll tell the story. Did anybody remember Terms of Endearment, the movie? Remember when Shirley MacLaine went screaming out into the hospital that her daughter needed one more shot for her pain medication? Oh, is there volume, or do you want me just to mouth the words? Anyways, I feel like, well, they're figuring that out, that you have to be that way, right? Sometimes it takes that moment, right? This is your child, this is your wife, this is your son, whatever it is. You have to remind people sometimes because they have very busy lives. They've got 50 patients they're treating. You just have to be the loudest one they're treating at that moment. And so that Shirley MacLaine moment, you know, we joke about that a lot. It takes that sometimes to get the response that you need. I don't know what's going on back there. But in the room, how many people have actually participated in a clinical trial? And how many of you that participated had a really great experience? About half and half. I think that you know, what we see in participation in clinical trials is that more often than not, the challenges come with misaligned expectations. And a lot of that is just communication. I think that you know, when we work in clinical trials, for most of the world, we think about big diseases with, you know, several 100,000 patients a year. In rare diseases, it's different. You may be the only patient in the clinical trial. And so for a lot of you, when we talk about ADCY5 or some of these ultra-rare diseases, there is the possibility that if you can find a researcher and a physician and work with them, you can open what's called an investigator-sponsored IND. So a single physician can open a clinical trial. They write a protocol. It's much simpler than a regular pharmaceutical protocol. And that physician then has, oh.
Well, it's a war. Nixon declared it. It's the war on cancer.
As long as it's not a war on me.
No, it's not a war against you. It's a war against your body.
Well, that doesn't sound...
Our doctor said...
That's Dr. Gerber?
Mm-hmm.
Right, Dr. Gerber said a few weeks of chemo. He said they caught it early. Mm-hmm. He thought a few weeks of chemo, and well, he thought she'd be out of the woods.
Your blood work and your x-rays, these are not, as they say, good.
Getting worse.
Well, if by worse you mean the cancer's spreading, then yes. But there is a trial, clinical trial, that might be beneficial.
Yeah? Yeah, of course.
Mm-hmm. We'll try anything.
It's a new drug. Let's call it Xanadu.
Is that its name?
No, that's just what they're calling it for the trial. This drug, Xanadu, it has shown promise.
And I'll be getting that drug as part of the trial.
Yes, that or a placebo.
A placebo?
Yeah, I don't understand.
You see, in order to ascertain the effectiveness of a drug, it has to be judged in a controlled setting against an equal number of patients that are not getting the drug.
And those patients, the ones not getting the drug, they get...
Oh, it's like a Smartie. You know Smarties.
Well, hold on, I'm confused. You said Betsy would be part of the trial, so...
Am I getting the real drug or the fake drug?
That I can't say. Shall I sign you up?
So, you know, clearly that's Yeah, I'd like to say that's a little bit of hyperbole. That might be pressing how it really happens, but unfortunately, a lot of conversations with physicians about clinical trials are exactly that way. And so sometimes we lack the sensitivity in discussing with the patients around what's going to happen in a clinical trial. For a lot of clinical trials, it's true, we have to use placebos in order to understand just what kind of effect the disease has. In the discussions we've had over the last couple of days, in the rare disease community, it's why the natural history studies are so important, right? The physicians that are studying your disease need to understand what does a disease look like without intervention so that we know what kind of changes we have to make to show that the drug works. Unfortunately, and we've heard some of this as well, the FDA is somewhat behind in the way that they think around clinical trials when it comes to orphan disease. That's not an understatement, right? Okay. So, you know, we have set up a system to run clinical trials for really big diseases. So if you're testing 50,000 patients and half of them get a placebo and half of them get standard of care and half of them, you know, get the drug, it's different than if there's only 4 patients. And so we're working with the FDA to figure out how do we redesign clinical trials so that in the rare disease community, you know, we don't have to give a patient something that's not efficacious like a placebo. We have a much better time arguing with the FDA about creating protocols where placebos are not used in the rare disease community. But it is a challenge for us to understand how we prove that a drug is working. So in clinical trials, we write protocols. The physicians, the researchers you're talking to, they write protocols to show endpoints so we know how the drug is working. Sometimes, and this is where the rare disease community and the advocates have to work with the FDA and work with your advocate organizations to change legislation and things like that and policy. But sometimes, if you take Duchenne's as an example, the endpoint that they use in Duchenne's is the 6-minute walk primarily. But if you talk to Duchenne patients and Duchenne parents, the 6-minute walk is not actually what they care about. Right? I was talking to somebody the other day, a parent who said, and I think they mentioned it again up on stage, you know, it's not so much about the 6-minute walk for their child as it is the ability to control the controller on their wheelchair. Right? So it is that hand motion, not the 6-minute walk. It is about quality of life. It may not be about longevity of life. And so we're having to retweak how we run clinical trials and talk to the FDA and create endpoints. Because in the rare disease population, a cure is not always what we're going for. In some cases, it's just how to modify the disease so that patients have a better quality of life while we try to get to a cure. And so it is baby steps. But when you're talking to your physician or you're talking to the people that are running the clinical trial, those are important questions for you to ask. What does the endpoint look like for this trial? What can I expect if the drug works? And you have to be comfortable if it's a baby step. Is that the trial that you want to be in? In some cases, for some of the diseases, there may be 4 or 5 different pharmaceutical companies working on that particular disease. So you may have options, and it gets more challenging to choose what trial to go on. In some cases, and I think Dr. Ring talked about this, we create inclusion and exclusion criteria so that we can really understand the population we're treating. For many of the patients in rare disease communities, those inclusion-exclusion criteria exclude them from participating in the trial. That is a heartbreaking discussion. If you have traveled from Minneapolis to Dallas to be in a clinical trial, you get all of your tests done on your child, and they come back and they say, thank you for coming, but unfortunately you can't participate in this trial. At that point, I think you have to start asking more and more questions. If you're not eligible for that trial, are there other drugs in the marketplace that are currently approved that may be useful in your particular disease that can be used off-label? Are they willing you to treat your child or yourself off-label with a currently marketed drug? We talk about clinical trials in the realm of formal clinical trials that are run by drug companies or the National Institutes of Health. But the reality is, in rare disease, there are lots of things going on that are kind of quote-unquote clinical trials of one, right? And so I talked with Emily from the Cystic Fibrosis Group, Emily's entourage, who's currently on a trial of one, because she got together with her physicians and said, there's this drug that works and this drug that works. They're both approved. Let's try to put them together and put me on it and see if it works. They got a physician-sponsored IND. She's the only person on the trial. But that's a clinical trial. It may not be it in the formal sense, but what they learn from that one individual on those 2 drugs can be used for future people that are in those clinical trials. So, I think you have to get away of thinking that you're going to be in a big clinical trial that's sponsored by a Pfizer, a Genentech, and Eli Lilly. Sometimes it's really just working with your physician to try something new for that particular patient. Everybody is part of that process. Everybody is part of the research. I think you hear a lot, you have heard a lot. Margie mentioned it, Dr. Ring mentioned it, several other presenters have mentioned it. Some of the parents I have heard them say, I'm just a parent, I'm just an advocate. When you are writing down everything that has happened to your child in the last 5 years, and you are tracking every medication they are on, and you're tracking every bit of the quality of life that they have, that is research. You are conducting a clinical trial of one. That research is tremendously valuable when you start collating it with other parents' research, right? And so I don't want you to discount what you do in your daily lives with your children or yourselves. That is part of being the research. We can't cure diseases, we can't treat diseases if we don't have participation in the process. The rare community is a little bit different. I think there's much more eagerness and willingness to participate in research. I was a little bit taken aback by the comment this morning by the woman who said she lived in a rural state and that people were a little bit freaked out by participating in trials that were surveillance or registries or we were tracking the patients. And that is simply us being stupid about how we use language, right? So yeah, it's a surveillance trial, but I bet if I sat down with those people in that rural state and said, you know what we're trying to do? We're trying to follow all of the people in your state so we can match it to all the people in the other 49 states so that when we look at all of the patients together, we can get a better answer to see how to treat your disease. So it is kind of back to that physician disconnect, that lack of ability to communicate in a way that patients understand, getting to the very basic level of what you're trying to accomplish. And in clinical trials, I think a lot of the time, researchers and physicians forget that there's a tremendous impact on the language we use with parents, patients, and advocates, and that we really need to kind of step back and simplify those discussions that we have. We have to take very complex ideas and really simplify them down, not only for the parents and advocates, but certainly for those of you that have children with rare diseases. They're part of the research as well, right? We have to make sure they understand what's part of the process in the clinical trial and why we're treating them and what we're trying to get through. Everybody's part of that process. At PRA and within Scott's division, we spend a lot of time tailoring communications to children. We spend a lot of time with physicians and nurses helping them understand how to communicate with parents in a way that is more understandable. And I can tell you, and I can just beat the drum loudly, again, if you don't understand something, if you are the slightest bit uncomfortable, you should have no hesitation at ever pushing the people you're talking to give you the answer that makes you comfortable. I have sat in lots of physician waiting rooms, I have sat in lots of physician rooms and just been a total pain in the ass until people finally get to the point where they talk to you in real terms. I think I have one more slide up there. The truth about clinical trials, of course, is that at the end of the day, we are all trying to find a cure. There are about 13,500 employees in our company. We talk at meetings all the time. We remind them during their orientation. I don't care if you are an administrative assistant in the organization or you are a PhD level scientist or an MD working on trials. At the end of every single day, we have patients on the other side of what we do who have either themselves or their mothers or their brothers or their sisters that are participating in research. And so when people get up and come to work in our organization, they have to be reminded that there is no coming to work and giving 80 or 90%. Every 13,500 employees in our organization have to get up every day and give 110%. Because next week or in a month or two, it could be their child, it could be their mother, their sister, their brother, it could be them that have a rare disease that needs to be treated. We have employees in our organization that phenomenally have been cured of a tremendously rare disease. And so that's why we get up every day and run clinical trials. It is to help the people on the other end of the trial to find a cure or a treatment. I already talked about all that. The end of why. So why do I do this? I've been doing this for 25 years. And I remember back in the mid-'80s when I worked in an AIDS hospice, and every single patient that came in the door passed away. And today, we have a medication that is 99% effective in preventing the transmission of HIV virus. I can tell you in 1985, nobody ever thought we would have a cure. It wasn't even on the horizon. Today, a single pill a day can prevent that virus. That is amazing. And so I think back to the evolution of my career, and I think if we can do that, we really can do anything. It took the whole world to come together to fix that. And so it really is about awareness and getting enough researchers and enough advocates and enough voices of the folks in rooms like this to really push that research. I don't care if it's 2 kids in the world that have the disease or 1 million. There's enough people out there that are willing to do research, whether it's grant funded. I think you had asked the question about funding. There's a lot of grant dollars out there, or whether it's pharma research. There's a lot of people out there that are willing to help, regardless of how rare or ultra rare the disease is. This woman on the screen is one of my dear friends, Lori. She had an ultra-rare form of leiomyosarcoma. I've talked to several of the LMS folks here at the conference. It was a particularly aggressive form of the disease. The primary treatment was surgery. Her tumors at one point were doubling every 2 weeks. The tumor volume at one point was unbelievably incredible, with a distended abdomen, and I worked with Lori for 8 years. I can tell you that every single conversation we had with the physicians was a fight. Nobody wanted to treat her. Nobody thought it was worth treating her. Her disease was too advanced. We sent parts of her tumor to 4 or 5 different pathologists around the world. We had oncologists on the West Coast, East Coast. We had an oncologist in Europe. We had multiple phone calls where we made everybody get on the call and hash it out. The East Coast physicians treated it one way. The West Coast physicians treated it another way. The Europeans just wanted samples of her tumor because it was this weird mixoid type of germ cell and leiomyosarcoma. And so, but I can tell you every step of the way, we drove that process. It was the team forcing all of those people to get on the phone together to talk about this. We created our own kind of mini tumor board. But I can guarantee you, it wasn't the physicians that were like, hey, we should all get together and talk about Lori today. At one point, we went, there was no clinical trials left. We went and talked to a physician about surgically removing all of her tumors and then bathing her peritoneum with a chemotherapeutic agent. Hadn't really been done before in this disease, but it made sense. We'd done it in other diseases. When we went to the surgeon said, you know, I just don't want to do that. Why? You know, what it came down to was, at that particular institution, they had very low mortality statistics for surgical intervention. She was too high a risk for dying on the table that would mess up their statistics. I kind of lost my mind during that conversation. And to Lori's point, in the meeting, she's like, I'm the one that's going to die, not you, right? And so cut me open, because I would rather die trying than die not trying. Those aren't easy conversations to have. Sometimes it freaks out the physicians. She had the surgery. She got another 2 years cancer-free. And so, you know, we went back to the doctor and we're like, see, right? So the next time somebody asks you this, the next time that risk comes up, he's a little more likely to take that risk because we pushed that issue. Finally, when things were getting a little bit tense, this is Lori in her diving gear. She had lost most of her liver. She had lost 2/3 of her lung, her right lung. She had 19 tumors in her left lung. She had a bunch of tumors in her kidney. And she's like, well, I want to go diving. I'm going to die. I want to go diving. And all the doctors are like, you can't go scuba diving. That's crazy. And she said, I'm going diving because I'm going to die. I'm going to have a fun time. So she took scuba diving courses. She flew to the Maldives. And this is her before her first dive. She went on 5 diving trips after that, despite the fact all the physicians said don't. And then she ran out of therapies. We found a clinical trial for a drug called Opdivo. And they said, well, you're too sick to go on it. I happened to be at the American Society of Clinical Oncology that week. I found her oncologist. I said, you know, we should at least give it a try. They weren't really inclined to do that. I went and found the Bristol Myers Squibb rep. I said, can we get this drug from you in compassionate use since it wasn't labeled for her disease? They said, sure. We found a physician in Santa Monica through doing our PubMed searches that was doing a lot of sarcoma research. We called him up. He's like, sure, if you fly down here, I'll treat you. His group had a little challenge filling out forms, so we filled out all the forms for him. We worked with the team, the pharma company, which was a little slow in getting the drug, which begs the question if they understand what compassionate use is. And finally, we got the drug that nobody wanted to treat her with, and we got another 6 months before she passed away. That tenacity, right? Not taking no, fighting, reaching out, pushing the envelope all the time. The number of times we got her enrolled in kind of quasi-clinical trials or got physicians to try things that weren't approved or try different remedies or try different things was amazing. But it wasn't without a lot of work. And then the other thing to think about, and I mentioned this with the Duchenne case, at a certain point in the treatment options for Lori, we decided that quality of life was more important than cure. And so there were some treatment options that were available that would have lowered her quality of life to a point that just wasn't acceptable for her. And so it became this trade-off. And I think when you talk with your physicians, you also need to understand a lot of the treatments that we're testing have toxicities associated with them that may impact quality of life. And what are you willing to do in exchange for a potential cure? In Lori's case, she wanted to spend the last 6 months really kind of living a full quality of life and not being in a hospital every week and risking a lot of toxicities. But this is why I do what we do. This is why most people, I think, do clinical trial work that are in our industry, because most of us have a Lori in our life, or they have a child or a mother or father. My father died of glioblastoma. We got him on a clinical trial when Avastin was being tested. And so this is what drives us. I can tell you the reason that PRA Health Sciences partnered with Global Genes is because the very first phone call we had with Nicole and Kathy and the team here was phenomenal. Their mission in finding a cure and not taking no for an answer for the rare disease community, for every single person at this conference, for every advocate that's here, was just mind-blowing for us. And so Scott and I, in those early conversations, said, we have to be part of this community. You know, as a global organization, we work with every single pharma company out there. Every time we have a conversation with a pharma company that's starting to develop a drug in the rare disease community, it is our mission to figure out how do we connect as many patients as possible with that disease and get them into this trial to give them treatment options. And so that is why we are big supporters of this meeting and this organization. And I can tell you, after having been here for a few days, my mind is blown, and we will continue to be huge advocates and partners in the journey for the folks in the room. I think you've heard lots about resources today. Clinicaltrials.gov has lots of information of clinical trials that you may be eligible for. The challenge with the rare disease community is many of you have diseases or have children with a disease that has not been classified yet as an official diagnosis. So sometimes it's hard to find clinical trials because the words don't always match. Advocacy websites for sure, your doctor, and then me. So at the bottom here, you can write this down. That's my email address at PRA. I talk to people, as does Scott, as do many of the folks in our organization. We have almost 120 MDs. We are more than happy to talk with you and help you navigate the process. If you're trying to find a clinical trial, if you have questions about how to work with a physician, I'm happy to intervene. I have made lots of hard phone calls for people and called physicians out on behavior that I thought was not really as helpful as it could be for the patients trying. So, and sometimes just navigating that landscape, people that understand the words we use and the vernacular can help. But Scott as well, if you send me an email and I can't do it, I'll send to Scott or somebody. But we are there to help. I am happy to answer any phone calls, emails, whatever. I'm here for the next couple of days. Find me. I'm happy to connect you with the right people. If you have questions about a particular trial or trying to find a trial, or if you've had a bad experience, let us know, because that information also helps us for the next trial to help make sure that doesn't happen to another patient. So again, I can't thank everybody enough in the room. I wish everybody was in this room, because every single person that's at this meeting is part of what is changing the world, right? We are agents for change. Never doubt a single voice. One voice in this room is more than enough to change patient lives. And so when a lot of those voices to get together, it gets a little bit easier, but one voice is enough. So thank you very much. We can, I think we have a few minutes for questions, if anybody has any questions, or.
My name is Penny. I'm with the ADNP Kids Research Foundation. So our syndrome was just discovered about 3 years ago. The information on the internet that all of our doctors and specialists access isn't updated, or it's outdated, and there's not enough information. The problem we have with getting any sort of like clinical trials or testing to get our kids into a clinical trial is that our doctors just don't know enough. And then they just see us as a parent. So like my son has a lot of GI issues, and I can't get them to do any further testing because they just classify it as dysmotility. Do you have any suggestions for like keywords we can use, or specific websites we can guide them to take us more seriously and to just follow what we know about our children?
So, you know, one thing, and I forgot to mention this, for a disease like that, right, you as the parent likely know more about that disease than 99% of the physicians currently in the world, right? So you spend a lot of time educating people when you're talking to the physician. And what we see with a lot of the rare diseases is that physicians treat the symptoms before they treat the disease, right? So whether it's dysmotility or whatever, they're just trying to get the symptoms treated without getting to the root cause. But you're right, so the majority of physicians, when I said 95% of the patients in the US don't participate in research, that's also true about physicians, right? The majority of physicians have a general lack of understanding of how to participate in a clinical trial, how to participate in research, what the resources are they need. If your physician has questions about that, you certainly can email me. We are happy to connect with physicians. We have a program to take untrained physicians and treat them about clinical research, how to participate in the process. You know, it's hard, and find me afterwards. I think we can talk about the more specifics for your particular case and words you might use to have that conversation with them. I think that Margie said it best. I mean, you know, they put their pants on the same way you do, right? I think that you need to empower yourself that the conversation you're having with them, you know more than they do, right? And so sometimes it just takes a little bit to stimulate their thought process, right? This isn't about the dysmotility of the gut. This is about something else. How do we get to that? If you have enough answers about the gut issues, what are the other symptoms that you think need to be tested? Sometimes it takes pushing to get those tests run. They're not always covered by insurance. You have to, you know, there's all of that discussion as well. And in some cases, you need to go to an institution like the NIH, or in some cases, depending on the disease, places like St. Jude's, where most of those things are covered outside of the insurance coverage arena. And those individuals at the NIH and places like St. Jude's and some of those organizations, I mean, their mission is to answer those types of questions. And I get it, sometimes, you know, that's a lot for people. Travel is very challenging. Scott and his group works a lot with families in the rare disease community, because we may only have 4 or 5 sites in the whole country that are running a trial, and that doesn't match the 90% of the patients that are coming from far distances. We have lots of pharmaceutical companies that pay for people to travel. They pay for airfare, they pay for bus rides, they pay for car rides, they pay for reimbursement, they give you stipends for hotels. So there are lots of ways. If you don't know that's available, if you don't know to ask for it, it can look daunting. It never hurts to ask. Say, hey, I'm happy to help do your research, but this is a challenge for my family, right? And this is what I need to support me to do it. So, but in your particular case, either one of us, Scott or I, can help you, and we're happy to help you with language and things like that. Sure.
I was hoping you could give me some advice for the situation that I'm in. I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and I've gotten a lot better. My doctor was just trying to help me heal. I'm very severely affected. And something ended up working very, very well on my condition, and it's a shot from a compounding pharmacy. So what my geneticist at UCLA tells me is that no one can make any money off of this, so you'll never get a clinical trial. And where to go next, because I don't think I should be the only one doing better, right? What do you think?
So, I mean, I don't know how big is the patient population or the community?
Ehlers-Danlos is a very common rare disease, and it's not understood very well. I'm on another round of genetic review. Hope I can find my cause, because then at least we would know more about why this helps me so much. I'm cause unknown right now, but there's Ehlers is around. Very underdiagnosed condition. It makes people contortionists.
And so, I mean, compounding drugs is certainly an interesting methodology. You know, when I talk about kind of, it's not always being in a formal clinical trial. It is people like you who are taking, you know, new drugs and putting them together. And
it's not even a drug. I mean, it's inexpensive. I probably spend $60 or $80 a month. I give myself a shot every day, and I've never stopped getting better. I was in bed on morphine, you know, planning my suicide. Got off all my drugs. Living my life.
And where do you share that information currently?
Well, you know, the geneticist said, well, try social media and tell people, but to tell a patient, go to ask your doctor to do this for you and prescribe something like this, because I do need prescriptions to get syringes and everything. It takes a certain very pushy kind of person to get a doctor to do something.
Yeah.
I'm that person who I demand answers I understand, and I demand that we make me the priority. So I really appreciate some of the things you said about that. But also, people with Ehlers-Danlos are very sick. They're just very, very ill. And I've had doctors tell me, more than one, that they limit the number of Ehlers patients they will take because we're so sick, we have so many different problems. And something about the disease makes people very difficult to communicate to. There's a lot of brain fog, and there's just constant pain, and just whatever. I mean, one thing that happened from my shots is I became able to think, which was nice because it was very hard. So, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, it's interesting. I'd have to know more about you know, what they're compounding and things like that, who owns those agents that are being compounded. I think that you could reach out to the manufacturers of those particular compounds and have a discussion around.
That's a great idea.
You know, so somebody's making those things that they're compounding, right? And so, you know, they may be completely unaware that anybody in the world ever put their compound together with anything to treat your particular disease, right? And so if they don't know, there is nobody thinking about it. I saw something on the Twitter feed up there that said, you know, something about if you're afraid of having a conversation or giving an idea to somebody, just remember that a bunch of people got in a room and said, let's make a movie about sharks in a tornado, right? And so that is true. If nobody in the world is thinking that those compounds could possibly work in your disease, then I guarantee you, I mean, Scott and I meet with development companies and pharma divisions all the time. I mean, you know, they just work at what's in front of them, right? Somebody tested it on an animal somewhere and it worked. And so all of a sudden it takes a life of its own. But until that information gets to those scientists, they don't know that there's a question to be answered. So I would find out currently who's manufacturing those drugs.
I know who is.
Oh, yeah.
I appreciate that. I'll send you an email.
Yeah, send me an email, because we can figure out like who at those companies are doing research. So
Exactly. And I just wanted to add, I mean, you mentioned that your physician said something to the effect of no one will ever really develop that because they won't make any money.
That was a very big geneticist at UCLA. Like, totally, you're better. We get it. We see it.
I think
most Have a nice day.
Yeah, right. And so I think we hear that, right? And I think there is a sense of some reality to that. But I think the trends we're seeing around, you know, orphan drug designations, financial incentives, patent extensions, more and more encouragement for pharma companies to take these drugs, or maybe a mixture of drugs that are sitting on a shelf somewhere that we know work, they just need a little bit of resources to them. We're seeing more and more of them being developed, and people sort of doing the right thing for diseases that are a lot less common than yours. So I can empathize with that perspective, but I would push back on that, and I think that that's a little bit of a skeptical, negative opinion you're receiving, and I think times are changing.
Yeah, I mean, he has a career about something else, and people have these people, they work so hard, these doctors, and they're so overloaded making decisions and dealing with hopeless patient populations. They get worn out too. I just find reasons to go see people and tell my story to people and hope that somebody will, you know, be interested enough to tell somebody else or try something. So thank you. That's
Thanks.
helpful.
Absolutely.
Thanks for stepping up. Any other questions?
Oh, yeah. Oh, one more question here. Right there.
So my son was diagnosed when he was about 8 months old with Cornelia de Lange syndrome, and now he's almost 15 and he lives in a group home. And like you had said, that a lot of the time he's being treated for his behaviors and not the actual his syndrome. And since he lives in that home, to be able to take him anywhere to go to a clinical trial or even find one. Is there a way I can go, is it possible that I can go online and look to see what kind of trials are being done and maybe, I don't know, put his syndrome in or, his, something, his traits of the syndrome in and see what's being done and what medications are being used and maybe go back to his doctor with or a psychiatrist, because I've told her, I don't like the medication he's on. It's not a long-term medication. She's like, oh, but he's doing so well on it. I'm like, no, he's not. It's not, it's lithium and it's a toxic, it could be a toxic,
Sure.
And it's not good for him. And he's been on it since he's about 9 years old. And, so I would rather find a medicine that's maybe more for his syndrome than just that one behavior when he's nonverbal and, maybe he's hurt or he's not feeling good or that's why he's behaving this way. It has nothing, nothing to do with, his syndrome but I mean, obviously he has anxiety and it needs to be treated, but I'd rather treat the syndrome than certain behaviors, whatever's going on in that moment. Like, oh, well, let's treat this, let's fix this, let's fix that. It's like, well, maybe there's something, I mean, I don't know, because it's so and again.
Have you explored things like clinicaltrials.gov?
No, I didn't know anything
Okay.
about it. That's why I was asking, is there a
Yeah,
website
yeah.
I can go to?
Clinicaltrials.gov is probably your first choice. You'll have to put in kind of keywords, put in the disease, see if anything comes up. Sometimes you can put in the syndromes associated with the disease and see if anything comes up.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of, if there's a trial available,
Yeah.
At the end of it, it will show the name of the person who's coordinating that trial that you can call or email.
Okay.
Below that will be a listing of all of the centers that are participating by state, so you can see who's closest. In addition to that, if you go to PubMed, pubmed.gov, that is attached to the National Library of Medicine. It really is the clearinghouse worldwide for all researchers that are publishing. You can look if anybody's publishing in your particular disease. It will have links to abstracts and papers that you can download and read. You can print those off. You can take them to your physician. You can say, hey, there's this guy doing research in this particular treatment methodology. Is there anything that we can do to get my son on that? And maybe it won't be that particular therapy, but it'll start the dialogue with them. Yeah, you'll have something to do. So I would start with those two resources. And, it may take a little bit of investigative time on your point. So you might find a guy in London that's doing research. You might have to send an email or call them. They may know physicians in their network that are doing things. Yeah. So it is kind of connecting the dots for you, but it's a really good place to start.
That's where that's why I wanted to come here, trying to find something, because going to her, she's like, oh, no, he's working so well. And I'm like, but this is just, you're just fixing the initial problem. This is, maybe there's a medicine. She's like, oh, well, but nobody knows of it because it's so rare. So I'm like, well, I'm going to California.
Somebody else knows of it. So, but those are two great places to start.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And what was the first one? I'm sorry. The first
clinical. So clinical, like clinical. And then clinical trials is all one word, .gov. It's somewhat user-friendly. They could have done a better job.
I'll figure it out. It's fine.
But once you get there, you can put in the keywords.
Well, thank you so much.
Is that it? Is there one more question? Emily.
document the data and present it in really clear and compelling ways and show that paper to your doctor. And I think those metrics, you kind of translate your really useful insight into a language that is more easily consumable by your doctor or the research community. And I think one, kind of brings up a big point, which is that it's not only about physicians and researchers translating language into, terms that are understandable to us lay folk, but it's also about, we have tremendous, as patients and parents, tremendous expertise, and we need to translate that into ways that researchers and physicians can understand as well. And so I found data is often a really good way to do that.
Totally. All right, thanks everybody, and I look forward to seeing you the rest of the day.